What if a serial killer wasn't just trying to hide, but was begging to be famous? This one wrote letters to the newspapers, mailed complex ciphers, and signed his work. For over 50 years, his identity has been the ultimate cold case. He called himself the Zodiac, and he didn't just vanish, he disappeared behind a trail of riddles and blood. This is the hunt for the man who wanted the world to know his name, but never his face. The place was ordinary. That's what made it so dangerous. Lake Herman Road, just outside Vallejo, California, a narrow strip of pavement winding past a water pumping station. To the local teens, it wasn't a road. It was a lover's lane, a place to park, to talk, to be away from prying eyes. On the night of December 20, 1968, the air was cold, the darkness almost complete. David Arthur Faraday, 17, an Eagle Scout and wrestler, picked up Betty Lou Jensen, a 16-year-old honor student. They'd only known each other for a couple of weeks. It was a first date. They went to a friend's house, then to a Christmas concert at Betty's school. Sometime after 10 p.m., David drove them out to Lake Herman Road. They parked on a gravel turnout, the engine off, the world reduced to the inside of that car. They had a curfew, 11 p.m. They likely meant to keep it. Between 11:05 and 11:10 that night, another car pulled up. It parked just a few feet away. The driver didn't get out immediately. Then he did. What happened next was methodical and fast. The man walked around to the driver's side of David's car, a .22 caliber pistol in his hand. He fired several shots into the vehicle, but missed the teenagers inside. Panic erupted. Betty Lou scrambled out of the passenger door and started to run. David was right behind her. As David stepped out, the gunman shot him once in the head. He then turned and chased Betty Lou. She was running for her life along that dark, lonely road. He fired 6 times. 5 bullets struck her in the back. The entire attack lasted less than 3 minutes. Then, the killer got back in his car and drove away, leaving the silence to rush back in. A passing motorist found them just minutes later. Betty Lou Jensen was dead at the scene. David Faraday was still breathing, but he died on the way to the hospital. The police found no useful footprints, no clear tire tracks, no witnesses. The only theory that made any sense to detectives was that a madman, a random predator, had chosen this spot and these 2 young people. The investigation hit a wall. The months went by. The case grew cold, but the killer wasn't done. He was just getting started. 7 months later, on the 4th of July, 1969, the fear returned to Vallejo. Darlene Elizabeth Ferrin, a 22-year-old waitress and young mother, was out with a friend, 19-year-old Michael Renault Majo. Darlene was married, but she and Michael were friends. After a late phone call to her home, she picked Michael up just before midnight. Almost immediately, they noticed a car following them. Darlene, perhaps trying to lose the tail or out of a sense of dread, drove out of town toward a place she may have known too well. The parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park. It was another lover's lane, less than 2 miles from where David and Betty had been killed. She pulled in. Another car followed, parked nearby, then suddenly sped off. The relief was short-lived. 5 minutes later, the car returned. This time, it parked right beside them. A man got out. He carried a flashlight and a 9 pistol. He shone the light into the car. Thinking it was a police officer, Michael rolled down his window. The man didn't say a word. He simply raised the gun and started firing. A bullet hit Michael in the arm. Another struck Darlene in the neck. The killer walked back to his car, opened the door as if to get something, then returned. Michael, wounded and trapped because his door handle was broken, was struggling to get out. The gunman fired again, shooting each of them 2 more times. Then he was gone. Miraculously, Michael Majo survived. He gave police a description: a heavyset white man, about 58, with a round face and light curly hair, but it wasn't much to go on. Darlene Ferrin died at the hospital. The shooter had, once again, left nothing behind. But this time he wanted to talk. At 12:40 a.m., just minutes after the shooting, the Vallejo Police Department switchboard lit up. The call came from a payphone just 2 blocks from the police station itself. A man's voice, calm and clear, said, "I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." He hung up. The dispatcher, Nancy Slover, was left with the echo of that claim. "I also killed those kids last year." The police now knew the Lake Herman Road murders were not an isolated tragedy. They were dealing with a serial killer, and he was confident enough to call them, to insert himself into the investigation, to make it a conversation. The conversation was about to become a monologue, delivered to the entire San Francisco Bay Area. On July 31st, 1969, letters arrived at 3 newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times. Each contained 1/3 of a coded message, a cipher of 408 strange symbols, and each began with the same chilling paragraph: "Dear editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl last 4th of July. To prove I am the killer, I shall state some facts, which only I and the police know." He described details from the crime scenes that had never been made public. He was establishing his credibility, not to the police, but to the public. He wanted the people reading their morning paper to know he was real. He ended the letter with a demand: the ciphers must be printed on each paper's front page. "If you do not print this cipher by the afternoon of Fri. 1st of August 69, he wrote, "I will go on a kill rampage Fri night." The threat worked. The papers printed the cipher. And within days, a schoolteacher named Donald Harden and his wife, Betty, did what the police could not. They cracked the 408 symbol code. The world held its breath, thinking the killer's name would be revealed. It wasn't. The deciphered message was a rambling, egotistical rant. It read, in part, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. The best part of it is that when I die I will be reborn in PAIDICE, and all the I have killed will become MYSLAVES." It was a glimpse into a terrifying mind, but it was not a signature. It was a manifesto, and with it, the killer included a new name for himself. He was no longer just a murderer. He was the Zodiac. The symbol he used to sign his letters was not a signature, but a brand. A circle with a cross over it, like the crosshairs of a gunscope. It was the symbol of the astrological zodiac. He was claiming a cosmic significance, placing himself among the stars, eternal and untouchable. The police were now in a public relations battle with a ghost, and the ghost was winning. The Zodiac had their attention, and he loved it. His next letter, on August 4th, began with a now iconic declaration. "This is the Zodiac speaking." He complained that the police had misquoted him from his phone call. He wanted the record set straight. He was controlling the narrative, but letters were not enough. The cipher was just a game. The Zodiac needed to show he was more than a pen pal. He needed to commit a crime so brazen, in such a different way, that his power would be undeniable. On September 27, 1969, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, he did exactly that. Lake Berryessa is a picturesque reservoir in Napa County. It was a popular spot for picnics and swimming. Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, both students at Pacific Union College, were spending the day there on a blanket by the water. Around 4 p.m., they saw a man walking toward them from across the grassy knoll. He was wearing something strange, not a mask, but a full, black hooded costume. On his chest, a white 3x3-inch symbol was pinned. The Zodiac's crosshairs. He was holding a pistol. He approached and told them he was an escaped convict from Montana, that he needed their car and money to get to Mexico. He had them tie each other up with pre-cut lengths of clothesline. He assured them he would just leave them there. Brian and Cecilia, terrified, complied. Then, the man took out a long knife. "I'm going to have to stab you people," he said. He attacked Brian first, stabbing him repeatedly in the back. He then turned to Cecilia. After stabbing her, He calmly walked to Brian's car and used a felt-tip pen to write on the driver's side door. VLLEGO/122668/7469/SEP2769/630/BY knife. It was a ledger of his crimes. He then walked back across the field and vanished. Brian Hartnell survived 8 stab wounds. Cecilia Shepard, who managed to give a description of her attacker before she slipped away, died 2 days later. The horror of the scene was unmatched. This was not a shadowy shooting in the dead of night. This was a theatrical daylight execution. The hood, the symbol, the message on the car, it was a performance, and the audience was the entire terrified state of California. The Zodiac was no longer just a killer. He was a supervillain from a comic book, made terrifyingly real, and he was about to bring his show to the heart of San Francisco. Just 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, a cab driver named Paul Lee Stein picked up a fare in the city's theater district. The passenger asked to go to Presidio Heights, an affluent neighborhood. When the cab reached its destination, on a quiet, tree-lined street, the passenger in the back seat raised a gun. He shot Paul Stein once in the head. He then took the time to calmly cut a section from the cab driver's shirt, wiped down the cab, and walked away. This time there were witnesses. Teenagers in a house across the street saw the shooting. They called the police, describing the killer as a white male with curly hair. Crucially, they said he walked east, away from the scene. Police units flooded the area. 2 officers, Donald Falk and Eric Zelms, drove down the very street the witnesses had indicated. They saw a man walking calmly. He matched the general description. They shone their spotlight on him, but he didn't run. He just kept walking. For reasons that would haunt the investigation forever, the officers did not stop him. They had been given an initial description that the suspect was black, and the man they saw was white. By the time the corrected description came over the radio, the man was gone. The Zodiac had committed a murder in the middle of a major city and had almost been caught, and he couldn't wait to tell everyone about it. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. Inside was a swatch of bloody cloth. "I am the murderer of the taxi driver," the letter began. He included details only the killer would know. And then he mocked the police for their failure. "The SF police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly instead of holding road races with their motorcycles, seeing who could make the most noise." He signed it, as always, with the crosshair symbol. The taunt was a masterpiece of cruelty. He was in their city, he had killed, and he had watched them fail to catch him. The pressure on law enforcement was immense and public. The Zodiac's legend was now cemented. He was an omnipresent monster, communicating from the shadows, always one step ahead, and he had one more code to send. On November 8, 1969, he mailed what would become known as the Dripping Pen card to the Chronicle. It contained a new cipher, 340 characters long. "Either you would need a good laugh before you hear the bad news," he wrote. "You won't get the news for a while yet." He was talking about the cipher. He demanded it be printed, saying, "I get awfully lonely when I am ignored, so lonely I could do my thing." The 340 cipher was printed, and this time no one could break it. Not the police, not the FBI, not the army of amateur codebreakers who were now captivated by the case. The Zodiac had created a perfect mystery. He promised it contained his identity. For 51 years, it sat there, a locked door in the middle of the investigation, a symbol of his enduring puzzle. The letters kept coming. He sent bomb diagrams, threats about shooting out the windows of school buses. He wrote to famous attorney Melvin Belli, wishing him a happy Christmas with another piece of Paul Stein's shirt. He sent a Halloween card to Chronicle reporter Paul Avery, calling him "from your secret pal." The communications were erratic, spanning from 1969 to 1974. He claimed to have killed 37 people, and then, as suddenly as he appeared, the letters stopped. The hunt, however, had only just begun. With no more crimes, no more letters, The investigation turned to the mountain of evidence he had left behind. The fingerprints from Paul Stein's cab, the handwriting from the letters, the partial DNA from envelope stamps, and the endless theories. And there was one name, one suspect, that rose above all others. A man who was questioned, searched, and scrutinized for decades. A man who for many is the Zodiac. His name was Arthur Lee Allen. The letters stopped. The calls ended. After 1974, the Zodiac fell silent. But for the police and a growing number of amateur sleuths, the work was just beginning. With the monster seemingly dormant, the hunt turned from chasing a phantom to scrutinizing the real world he left behind. Every fingerprint, every handwriting sample, every memory from a witness became a sacred piece of the puzzle. And as they sifted through thousands of tips and suspects, one name began to surface again and again. A name that would come to define the frustrating, agonizing, almost, of the entire investigation: Arthur Lee Allen. Allen wasn't a stranger to the investigation. In fact, he had been on their radar incredibly early. On September 12, 1969, 2 weeks before the Lake Berryessa attack and a month before Paul Stein's murder, a tip came into the Vallejo Police Department. It wasn't from a detective. It was from a woman who was terrified of her own son. She was the mother of a man named Donald Lee Cheney. Cheney was a close friend of Arthur Lee Allen. And one day, over a year earlier in 1968, the two men had been driving. According to Cheney, Allen had looked out at the couples parked along the roads of Vallejo and said something that would later freeze Cheney's blood. Allen had talked about how he wanted to take a gun, go to a lover's lane, and shoot the people in the cars. He said he would use a flashlight taped to the barrel so he could see in the dark. He said he would call the police afterward to tell them about it. And most chillingly, he said he would call himself the Zodiac. When Cheney heard about the Lake Herman Road murders, a shooter at a lover's lane, he remembered that conversation. When he heard about the Blue Rock Springs attack, where the killer used a flashlight, his suspicion grew. And when the letters signed Zodiac were published, he knew he had to say something. He went to the police. And just like that, Arthur Lee Allen was in the file. Detectives interviewed Allen in 1969. He was a heavy-set man, about 58, with a round face. He wore glasses. He was an intelligent but troubled former elementary school teacher who had lost his job after being accused of inappropriate conduct with students. He lived in a trailer in Vallejo. He was odd, intense, and he had an answer for everything. The police searched his trailer. They found guns, including a .22 caliber pistol. They found hunting knives. They found a typewriter. But they found nothing that directly connected him to the crimes. No bloody clothing, no stolen car keys, no pieces of Paul Stein's shirt. Allen admitted he owned a Zodiac brand watch and even showed them the symbol on the face. He had an explanation for the day of the Lake Berryessa attack. He said he was out at the lake that day, but he was scuba diving. He had witnesses who saw him there, just not at the exact time of the stabbings. He was cooperative, but there was a strange, cold distance to him. The police had a powerful tip and a man who fit the general description, but they had no evidence to hold him. They let him go. The case against Allen didn't die. It simmered. Over the years, as different detectives inherited the cold case, they would return to his file. And every time they looked, more disturbing pieces seemed to fall into place. In 1971, a man walked into the police station in Southern California. His name was Ralph Spinelli, and he was an inmate in prison. He had a story to tell about his old friend, Arthur Lee Allen. Spinelli claimed that in 1970, Allen had shown up at his house with a bloody knife. Allen told him, "I'm the Zodiac. I killed a man in San Francisco." Spinelli said Allen talked about stabbing a couple at a lake. He even claimed Allen asked for help disposing of guns and other evidence. It was a bombshell account from a criminal associate, but Spinelli was a convict trying to cut a deal. His story was compelling, but it wasn't proof. Then, in 1974, another shattering piece of information surfaced. A former colleague of Alan's from his teaching days came forward. She recalled that one day, before any of the murders had begun, Alan had shown her a coded message he was working on. He told her that if he ever decided to kill people, he would send these codes to the newspapers and the police would never be able to crack them. The portrait of Alan was becoming darker, more detailed. He was a man with a violent temper. He was fascinated with codes and ciphers. He had expressed a specific fantasy about lovers' lane killings using a flashlight. He owned weapons that matched the Zodiac. He lived in the epicenter of the attacks. And people close to him were pointing fingers. The pressure built until 1991. A new detective in Vallejo named Larry O'Rourke decided to take a fresh, hard look at Arthur Lee Allen. He obtained search warrants for Allen's home, a small house in the town of Santa Rosa where Allen lived with his elderly mother. What they found inside was, for any Zodiac investigator, a treasure trove of circumstantial evidence. In a basement storage locker, they found boxes of disturbing belongings. There were dozens of watches, including several Zodiac brand watches. There were knives, guns, and ammunition. They found a huge collection of pornography, some of it involving children. They found a homemade bomb device. They found ropes and cords, and they found something that sent a jolt through the team. A hooded costume, similar to the one described at Lake Berryessa, though not an exact match. Most importantly, they found writings, pages and pages of Allen's handwriting. They seized it all, hoping this would finally provide the match, the one piece of forensic glue that could stick Allen to the crimes, his handwriting. The Zodiac's taunting letters were the most persistent physical evidence he left behind. If Allen's handwriting matched, it was over. The samples were sent to the best document examiners in the country. The results were definitive, and they were a devastating blow to the case. The experts concluded that Arthur Lee Allen could not be the author of the Zodiac letters. The writing simply did not match. The letter formations, the pressure, the slant, it was a different hand. It was a paradox that would haunt the investigation forever. How could a man be so perfectly, circumstantially guilty, yet fail the most direct test? Supporters of Allen's guilt argued the Zodiac could have deliberately disguised his handwriting. But the experts maintained that even with disguise, core characteristics usually shine through. These did not. The other great hope was fingerprint evidence. Partial prints had been lifted from Paul Stein's cab. They did not match Allen. In the 2000s, minute amounts of DNA were recovered from the saliva on the stamps and envelopes of the Zodiac letters. The profile was incomplete, but what they could get did not match Arthur Lee Allen. For the police, who had spent years convinced of his guilt, it was a professional and personal agony. They had their man, they could feel it. The facts of his life screamed it, but the cold, hard science of the 20th and 21st centuries whispered, no. Arthur Lee Allen was interviewed one final time in 1992 for a television documentary. He was older, sick with heart disease, but his demeanor was unchanged, a blend of smugness and detachment. He denied being the Zodiac. He blamed the police for harassing him. He said they had ruined his life. Just a few months after that interview, in August of 1992, Arthur Lee Allen died of a heart attack. He was never charged with any Zodiac crime. His death did not end the speculation, it amplified it. For many, he remains the prime suspect, a man who escaped justice not by cleverness, but by the limitations of the forensic technology of his time and a lack of that one irrevocable piece of evidence. For others, his exoneration by handwriting and DNA is definitive. The debate became, and remains, a civil war among Zodiac researchers. With Allen's passing, the case seemed to hit a permanent wall. The police departments, overwhelmed by new crimes, eventually marked the files inactive. The Zodiac had achieved a kind of dark immortality, becoming a ghost story, a topic for books and documentaries, a mystery deemed unsolvable. But in the digital age, mysteries find new life. Online communities of armchair detectives formed, sharing scans of letters, debating suspects, and obsessing over every comma the Zodiac ever wrote. And they kept returning to his original puzzles, the codes. The 408 cipher was solved in 1969, but the 340 cipher, the one sent in November 1969, the one that promised the bad news, had resisted all attempts. It was considered one of the most famous unsolved codes in the world. For 51 years, it sat there, a silent monument to the Zodiac's arrogance. Then, in December 2020, something extraordinary happened. A team of 3 private citizens, a software developer in the United States, a mathematician in Belgium, and a warehouse operations manager in Australia, working in their spare time, finally cracked it. They used advanced computer algorithms and human intuition to see a pattern that had eluded everyone for half a century. The news flashed around the world. The Zodiac's 340 cipher was solved. The world held its breath again, just as it had in 1969. This was it. After all the suspects, all the dead ends, the Zodiac had left the answer in his code. He said it contained his identity. This would be the final twist, the name we'd been searching for. The team published the solution. The deciphered message read: "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me, the WSNT me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I'm not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to PAIDIC all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me, where everyone else has nothing when they reach PAIDIC, so they are afraid of death. I'm not afraid, because I know that my new life will be an easy one. PARADICE death." It was another rant. Another twisted manifesto about slaves and paradise. It referenced a TV show, perhaps a taunt about a police sketch being broadcast. But there was no name, no location, no clue. It was another hollow victory. Another cruel joke. The emotional impact of that moment is hard to overstate. For the families of the victims, it was another reopened wound with nothing to show for it. For the detectives, past and present, it was a reminder of the killer's supreme, mocking confidence. He had built a maze designed to waste time and hope, and even when we finally reached the center, the room was empty. The code solution did one thing: it proved the Zodiac was, at his core, a liar. He promised meaning, but delivered only madness. He craved attention, not revelation. So where does that leave us? With a gallery of other suspects, each with their own passionate advocates. A man named Ross Sullivan, a mentally unstable library clerk from Riverside who resembled the composite sketch. A man named Richard Gaykowski, a newspaper employee with a grudge. A man named Lawrence Kane, a convicted killer with similar methods. The list is long, each theory a complex house of cards built on coincidence, supposition, and sometimes a desperate desire for closure. We are left with the evidence that cannot lie, but also cannot speak clearly. A partial DNA profile that excludes Arthur Lee Allen and many others, but is too incomplete to run against modern genetic databases for a familial match. Fingerprints that have been checked against millions of records and found no name. A handwriting sample that belongs to a ghost, and we are left with the victims whose stories are too often overshadowed by the myth of their killer. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen on a hopeful first date. Darlene Ferrin, a young mother trying to enjoy a summer night. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, 2 bright students on a sunny picnic. Paul Stein, a cab driver just doing his job. The Zodiac stole their lives to create his legend. He used their names to build his mystery. The greatest dishonor we can do to their memory is to become obsessed with the puzzle and forget the people at its heart. The hunt continues, now driven by genealogy, by data, by a stubborn refusal to let a cipher have the last word. But after all the letters, all the codes, all the suspects, and all the years, the most powerful question remains, a question that is both a challenge and a confession of our own failure to solve it. We wanted a monster from the shadows, but what if the real horror wasn't a monster at all? What if the truth about the Zodiac is far more ordinary and in its own way, far more terrifying? The silence after the solved 340 cipher was deafening. It wasn't the silence of an answered question, it was the silence of a void. For over 50 years, the code had been a beacon, a promise that the answer was there, locked in a grid of symbols. We broke the lock, opened the box, and found it empty. The Zodiac had lied. His grandest puzzle was just another taunt. It forced a painful, collective realization: we were not in a dialogue with a criminal. We were in a monologue with a myth, and myths are designed to be endless. So, what do you do when the mystery refuses to end, when the prime suspect is dead and excluded by science, when the codes reveal only madness, and the case files have gathered dust for decades? You go back to the beginning. You go back to the only things he couldn't completely control, the tiny, physical traces he left behind. In the 21st century, the hunt for the Zodiac moved from handwriting analysis and witness memory to the microscopic realm of cells and the vast, digital web of family trees. The most promising piece of evidence has always been the partial DNA profile. It was developed from the glue and saliva on the stamps and envelope flaps of the Zodiac's letters. For years, it was a fragile, incomplete string of genetic code, enough to rule someone out, but not enough to point definitively to anyone. The technology didn't exist to do more with it, but technology evolves. The emergence of genetic genealogy, the technique that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, changed everything for every cold case in America. The method doesn't require a perfect match in a criminal database. Instead, it uses the tiny DNA profile to find distant relatives in commercial genealogy databases. By building out those family trees, detectives can work backward to identify a common ancestor, and then forward through the branches to find a person of the right age, in the right location, who could be the source of the DNA. It is a long, painstaking process of elimination, and it is the single greatest hope for solving the Zodiac case today. Multiple agencies have pursued this path. In 2018, the Vallejo Police Department sent evidence to a private lab for advanced DNA analysis. The FBI has its own genetic genealogy unit working on the case. In 2021, a team of retired law enforcement officers and journalists operating as the case breakers made headlines by naming a new suspect based on genetic genealogy. That suspect was quickly dismissed by the FBI and the San Francisco police, who stated the DNA did not match. The announcement and its swift debunking highlighted the delicate, often frustrating nature of this new science and the intense public pressure for a name, any name. The process is slow, it is expensive. It requires meticulous care to avoid contamination of evidence that is over half a century old, and it carries a heavy ethical weight. Genetic genealogy touches the privacy of countless people who uploaded their DNA to find cousins, not to catch a killer. Every step must be justified, and every potential match must be handled with extreme discretion to avoid destroying an innocent person's life. This is the modern face of the hunt, not a detective in a trench coat staring at a cipher under a lamppost, but a scientist in a lab coat peering at a chromatograph in a sterile room, hoping to find a few more molecules to sequence. But alongside this high-tech search, the human heart of the case beats on, in living rooms and at kitchen tables, far from police labs and newspaper archives. For the families of the victims, the Zodiac is not a cipher. He is not a suspect file or a theory on a message board. He is the reason a chair has been empty for 55 Christmases. He is the silence where a laugh should be. The long-term damage of an unsolved crime is a special kind of torture. There is no verdict, no closure, no moment where society officially condemns the person who did this. There is only a question mark and grief that has nowhere to land. Darlene Ferrin's sister, Linda, has spent her life grappling with that question mark. She was a child when Darlene was killed. Her family was shattered. The publicity was relentless, and the mystery became a shadow over their lives. For decades, she avoided talking about it, the pain too raw. But as time passed, she found a different purpose. She now speaks, not about the Zodiac's legend, but about Darlene, the vibrant young woman who loved to dance, who was a devoted mother, whose life was real and full before it was stolen. For Linda, the mission is to reclaim her sister's story from the monster who took it. Brian Hartnell, who survived the brutal stabbing at Lake Berryessa, has carried the physical and emotional scars for a lifetime. He became a lawyer, built a life, but the memory of that sunny afternoon, the man in the black hood, and the loss of his friend Cecilia Shepard never left him. He has cooperated with investigators for decades, providing whatever he can, hoping his memory might unlock something. For him, the search is a duty to Cecilia. Then there are the amateur detectives. They are perhaps the most unique legacy of the Zodiac case. They are not police. They are not journalists. They are programmers, teachers, historians, and retirees. They are people like Tom Voigt, who has run the Zodiac Killer website since the 1990s, amassing a huge archive that even law enforcement consults. They are people like the trio who cracked the 340 cipher in their spare time. This army of the curious is driven by a mix of obsession, intellectual challenge, and a genuine desire for justice. They digitize old police reports. They analyze handwriting variations across the letters with sophisticated software. They create detailed timelines and maps, looking for patterns no one has seen. They debate suspects with the fervor of theologians arguing over scripture. Their contribution is undeniable. They have uncovered forgotten clues, pressured agencies to release documents, and kept public interest alive. But their world is also a minefield of contradiction. Online forums can turn toxic, with theorists fiercely defending their favorite suspect, sometimes harassing the families of people they accuse. Tips flood police departments, many based on wild speculation, consuming time and resources. The line between crowdsourcing and chaos is thin. This is the ecosystem of the Zodiac case today. A fragile collaboration between official, science-driven investigations and a sprawling, passionate, and sometimes chaotic public effort. It is unlike any other cold case in history, and it all leads back to the same haunting place. After all the DNA, all the genealogy, all the online debates, we must confront the man behind the symbol, not the suspect, but the perpetrator. Who was he really? The official evidence paints a psychological portrait. He was a narcissist of the highest order. He didn't just want to kill, he needed to be known for killing. The letters were not confessions, they were press releases. The codes were not clues. They were engagement tools, designed to make the public and the press participate in his game. He was likely socially inadequate, a man who felt powerless in his daily life, but experienced ultimate power in the terror he caused. The elaborate costume at Lake Berryessa wasn't just for disguise, it was for transformation. It was the moment he stepped onto the stage as his own creation, the Zodiac. He was organized, planning his attacks and his communications. He was adaptable, switching weapons and locations, but was he the criminal genius of legend? Probably not. The near capture after the Paul Stein murder suggests luck played a role. The police were minutes behind him. The composite sketch from that night is considered the most accurate, and it shows a relatively ordinary man. His handwriting, while unique, is not exceptionally skilled. His codes, we now know, were fairly simple substitution ciphers. The 340 held out not because it was brilliant, but because it contained an extra layer of randomness that broke standard solving techniques. What if the Zodiac's greatest trick was convincing us he was smarter than he was? What if his longevity as a mystery says less about his cunning and more about the perfect storm of pre-digital investigation, jurisdictional confusion between police departments, and the sheer, random chaos of the era? The late 1960s were a time of social upheaval. The Bay Area was an epicenter of change, protest, and violence. The Zodiac's first murder was months after the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. The Manson family murders happened in August 1969, right in the middle of the Zodiac spree. In that maelstrom, a local serial killer writing letters to the papers was a terrifying story. but it was one of many. He emerged in a gap in technology, in communication, in forensic science. He slipped into that gap and disappeared. And this leads us to the final, unsettling twist, the emotional conclusion of this story. We have searched for the Zodiac for generations. We have turned him into a supervillain, a dark icon. We have analyzed his every symbol, debated his every word. We have done this because we believe that if we are smart enough, if we look hard enough, the puzzle must have a solution. The idea that a crime this famous, this taunting, could just fade into nothing is unacceptable to us. We need the answer. We need the monster to have a face. But what if the truth denies us that? What if the Zodiac was, in the end, a profoundly ordinary man? A man with a boring job, a quiet house, a life of quiet resentment. A man who committed a handful of brutal murders, got the fame he craved for a few years, and then stopped. Maybe he died. Maybe he went to prison for an unrelated crime. Maybe he got scared or sick or just lost the desire. What if he is not a ghost haunting us, but a simple, ugly fact that is already buried in an unmarked grave or sitting forgotten in a nursing home, his mind gone? The hardest possibility to accept is not that he was a genius. It's that he was mediocre, that he escaped not by mastering the chessboard, but by the board being too big, too messy, and too dimly lit. His legend is not his creation alone. We built it with him. Every documentary, every book, every online theory, every time we stare at his ciphers, we are breathing life into the myth he wanted to create. We have become the eternal audience he demanded. The victims did not get to grow old. Their families did not get to have peace. But the Zodiac, whoever he was, achieved a form of immortality. He wanted his name in the paper. Today, his symbol is recognized worldwide. In a cruel irony, by failing to find him, we granted him his wish. So what are we left with? We are left with a choice. We can continue the hunt, chasing the faint hope of a DNA match, a deathbed confession, a forgotten fingerprint in a new database. That work is noble and necessary. Justice for David, Betty Lou, Darlene, Cecilia, and Paul deserves every ounce of effort that can be given. Or we can do something else. We can consciously, deliberately shift the focus. We can remember that this story is not, and never was, about a cipher or a hooded costume. It is about 5 people who were killed and 2 others who were forever scarred. It is about lifetimes of loss that can never be recovered. The greatest tribute to the victims is not to eternally polish the myth of their killer. It is to etch their own names, their own stories, in something harder than stone, in our collective memory. To say, we remember you, you were here, you mattered. Your lives were not just clues in his puzzle. The mystery of the Zodiac may never be solved, but the memory of the people he killed doesn't have to be a mystery at all. We can know them. We can say their names. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Michael Major, Brian Hutnell, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein. Their story is the only one that truly needs to be told, and perhaps in the end, it is the only one that can truly set us free from the shadow of the man who called himself Zodiac. The hunt for a ghost may go on forever, but the remembrance of a life, that is a story with an ending, a story of love cut short that deserves its own kind of peace.